Greetings, everyone. This is Virtuous Roots, where we reclaim virtue to bring into our home and yours. And I'm Thomas McCuddy.
And I'm Thomas Quackenbush.
And I'm Stacy McCuddy.
So, again, we have my lovely wife with us in studio as Nick is not here. And we're going to do a follow up because last time we were talking about parenting and sanctification. So, it's a great second part where we focused on the parents, but now we're going to focus in more on the kids and the particular raising of the kids. Really, the idea that and I've used this phrase before, that we're raising men and women. We're not raising boys and girls. I saw on social media there was some things happening where some kids were doing some things that were wrong. I mean, and technically, I think it was illegal what they were doing. And the consensus among people was, "Oh, just let boys be boys, let girls be girls. That's just what kids do."
Mm.
And there's part of me that reacts to that and says, "No, that we're trying to teach these children how to be adults. We're trying to actually mature them." Like there is a virtuous balance. There is a whole concept in virtue that deals with having fun, that we don't want to be, like sticks in the mud, but we also don't want to be the greatest word I had was buffoonery, the vice of
Mhm.
buffoonery. That's what I suffered from as a youth pastor. Those almost like American youth pastor mentality. It's like, how silly can you be? That's the buffoonery. So we don't want our children to be that. And so this notion, where do you think we should draw the line in terms of, letting kids be kids versus no, hey, you need to step up? What's some of the ways that we can think about finding that line and making that happen?
I think we encourage children to be playful. I mean, I think that's a huge part of childhood. They
Mhm.
need that time to play. They need to let their imaginations grow. They need time to be bored and be creative. And sometimes those are the things that kind of annoy us as parents, but they need that, that free time of exploration and growth.
Mhm.
But then, like you said, there's a difference between being playful and then pushing that boundary into just ridiculous silliness that's, inappropriate.
Yeah.
And, and also depending on the situation that you're in.
Mhm.
I think we have to teach children that, it's okay to play and do all kinds of things when you're in the backyard or, wherever, but you don't do that same kind of thing when you're sitting in
Yeah.
church,
It it's
or
when where it's appropriate.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It's well also like I know having boys and you guys Thomas probably does this as well. Is like they get this urge, they want to wrestle with their dads. And they want to, my daughter does that too. She likes to be tossed because she's into like gymnastics and stuff like that. But then, there's times where they get a little too rough. Like there's a place where because for us, we're not also, when we're playing with them and we're being silly, we're being playful with them. But there are boundaries and you got to teach them that, you can't, this is not appropriate or this is going a little too far in this behavior. Like we can wrestle, but there's rules and there's lines that we don't cross while we're doing this. And I found like you got to make them know that like this is, we can wrestle, we can play around, but this goes a little too far. And kind of showing them that they have to have fun within limits. It's not just like just endless pleasure or doing whatever they want to do.
I think that's part of teaching them how to live in the real world, that you
Hmm.
have that prudence of, I can do this in this situation, but
Yeah.
that's completely inappropriate in a different
and
situation.
and it all and I think it's perfect because we're thinking about the putting things in situation. A lot of people like to the either black and white. Just
Right.
don't do this at all, and there's no place for this exploration. And and then kids don't like they end up rebelling against that because there's some that's that creative like desire inside them needs to come out. And that black and white kind of either do this way or the right way or the wrong way. Like if there is prudence would dictate that whatever situation is, and it would give you that kind of you know well teaching them there's a spectrum of behavior, and you have to stay kind of in the middle of that spectrum, otherwise it becomes inappropriate on the other end.
And I think as the parent, you have to have that prudence as well
Mhm.
of, yes, I am raising them to be men and women. And yes, I want to parent with the end goal in mind, but you also have to protect the innocence of the child
Yep.
and allow that space for imagination and play and those things. You don't want to introduce adult concepts too soon for a child. I think that's another huge problem we
Hmm.
have in our culture is that we're discussing things with children that are inappropriate for children. So the same way, the child needs to know what is appropriate in certain situations, the parent needs to have that same prudence of this is not appropriate for a child.
Because if
So
you're crudely joking with them, or yeah, or especially like sexual matters or whatever,
mhm,
they start thinking it not as a sacred act between a married couple, but as a part of their play.
right.
It's like this is just part of play. This is brings me pleasure. It makes me happy. It's playful. Like no one's discouraging me from this behavior, and the world is actually encouraging me to indulge in it even more. Like, and so there's that dilemma within themselves that they're taking things because it's introduced too early. They're making that's their place of imagination and play and exploration, and they're associating something very serious and life changing like sexual behavior as something that they can just play around with.
And I think that's where, in the practice of prudence within the family, because there's no formula. It's not that, I mean, some things, like, generally, I would say, if it's illegal, that's off bounds. Like, you
Mhm.
shouldn't be doing that. When I say that, but that was one of the issues with what happened. Like, these kids had done something that was, I mean, and not like illegal, go to jail, get locked up, but just you're not supposed to, like, there's ordinances against what they were doing.
Mhm.
And but people were like, "Oh, it's no big deal." I was like, "Well, it is a big deal because that's clearly you shouldn't do that." But in the family, setting those boundaries, how the family operates, that's where I think parents need to bring that balance and realize, even as you are playing, even as, like, again, my boys, they want to wrestle, learning how to do that well, learning how to, even sometimes, even as we play, like, as weird as it's going to sound, like, wrestle with honor, like, don't do anything dirty,
Mhm.
and as far as, like, that's unfair or that's dangerous, or, like, if kids, particularly if they kind of get roughed up, somebody's like, oh, well, that's just kids being kids. Like, no, they crossed a line,
Mhm.
Yeah, I
and
think we need
identifying what that is.
sorry, I think we need to consider, like, sinful behavior, not just illegal
Yeah,
behavior,
Mm.
but are we allowing sinful behavior and encouraging sinful behavior in
exactly.
our children?
Mhm.
Again, if we don't have that end goal in mind, like, and a lot of people fall into the trap of, "Oh, it's just cute," kinda like what you
Yeah.
were saying, like, it's just kids being kids, "Oh, that's so cute, that's so funny the way they did that," but sinful behavior is not funny.
No,
I think it's because
it's
of
good.
of our own sinful nature. Because I'm just thinking, like, with our kids when they were younger, and, like, again, the things that they do, and when these little kids doing that, whether it's my kids or even we had some of the kids at church that were like that. I look at that and, like, we had a child that kinda grabbed some food and, like, hid under the table, like, immediately he knew what he was doing, grabbed the dessert, hid under, and it was one of those things. You look at it, it's really cute because this little kid has figured out, like, he knew to grab and run. But I also think through, okay, if the child is 3 and doing this, but what happens when they're 7? What
Mhm.
happens
Mhm.
when they're 15?
Yeah.
What happens when they're 20? And that's why these things that are really sinful, or these vicious behaviors, when we, not just tolerate them, but maybe even encourage them
Yeah.
because, oh, they're just being kids, we're setting them up that later on we're going to try to shift gears and we're going to try to change that. And I'm very much aware that even with my 7-year-old, he needs to become a man.
Mhm.
And I need to help him along that road, not push him too quickly, but that end goal. I think many times we as parents, we just sort of exist. A lot of parents, they just, well, I just got to get through the day, just got to get through the day. But these days are all pointing
Yep.
towards that future. And that's something we've got to get back on our radar.
Yeah, we're in that survival mode, and we're not taking that minute to think into the future that is just right here, right now. And I think I was thinking about a minute ago how, the whole like, oh, just let kids be kids kind of thing is that the parents sometimes don't want to take the effort to initiate the discipline that needs to take place.
Mhm.
It's just so much easier to just say, oh, that's just kids being kids instead of actually taking the time to address the issue. And that's not saying you have to like come down harshly on a 3-year-old who's eating a cookie under the table. There's that appropriate justice and
Yeah.
appropriate balance. Like you just say, let them know you need to ask mommy, before you have a cookie, or you need to, you know, like I said, don't take it without asking. Even though, it was cute that they hid under the table with it, you still need to address that behavior, but you're not gonna, like, bring the hammer down
Yeah.
on them,
Mm.
And
as as
and I,
hard as you can.
and I think that's the juggling with between justice and mercy, like trying, but you can't have mercy without first kind of instilling some form of justice and understanding. At least they can understand what they're doing is not appropriate. Like there's different levels of that inappropriate behavior. It's like, and that usually gauged by how upset the mom gets when they find, ought that, well, they ought to, because now sometimes they're just instilling that behavior in their own kids. For instance, my wife works at a public school. She teaches third grade, and um, this kid, I believe he got like in trouble because he hit some other kid. And then when my wife got in touch with the mom, that's precisely what the mom told the kid to do. Is
Mm,
if the kid's annoying you, hit him. And she's like, and so all that, like, all this effort that's put into, trying to, I mean, I know, like, whatever we feel about the public education, but we're not getting into that. But the idea of just trying to instill in some sort of, like, you want your kid to actually socialize properly, like in the world, and actually be successful. Like, that's not how you do it. You don't just, like, just because somebody annoys you or they give you a hard time, it's not wise, it's not prudent, it's not like just for them just to whack them. Like, that's not appropriate at all.
The whole idea of standing up for yourself, but knowing how to do it the right
Yeah.
way.
And
That this is what we have to teach them as children. And again, we like formulas. Well, if they do this, then do that. And the kids will typically do that. They're going to follow the formula. But that's what we understand as adults. It doesn't work that way. We have to walk with some wisdom, and we have to show them that very
mhm.
early how to gauge those things. And that's a part of that whole parenting process.
and I am gonna engage the homeschooling issue because you brought it up, so it's fair game now. And that, if we do have that end goal in mind of raising men and women, and I wanna clarify that, we wanna raise godly men and
Yeah.
women, not just
Mhm.
men and women, that, the question always is, what about socialization? How are you gonna make sure your homeschooled kids are socialized? But you run into that problem of in a public school situation where they're only amongst their peers, no matter their age. If they're 5 or they're 15, they're just lumped together with their peers, and so they never see that example of appropriate adult behavior. They're learning their behavior from other children and who are just as immature as they are. So they don't have that example of maturity
Mhm.
and of seeing how adults function together and seeing how a mature adult functions. If it is that, that their mom would do the same thing, that she would hit somebody who was
Yeah.
annoying her, that goes back to our previous episode about sanctification, that, you haven't made those changes in your
Yeah.
life
Or
to
not even
set
aware of
a
it.
mature example for your children. But I think we have the wrong mindset when it comes to that. That again, you don't want children doing only adult things. They still need that freedom to play and to be a child,
Yeah.
but they absolutely need to be around mature Christian adults that are setting that godly
Because I
example
mean,
for
it's
them.
just reciprocal too. Because we don't want to always just be serious all the time too, and like the children, that's like the other side of that sanctification that happens with having children. I know we're going back to the previous episode, but is to learn how to have joy in those little things
Mm.
again.
Mhm.
And that's the thing that I learned as a father, because you want to allow them, and you see, like, there's something about watching your kid just doing something they love.
Mhm.
And you're just like, wow. It's like you're just so happy for them. You would do anything for them just so that, like, because that brings so much joy to see them have joy themselves. And that's also stepping outside yourself and not just thinking about yourself. All of your love is now directed towards your child and their development. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is because we talk about, like, we're always looking retrospectively back on things and remembering our past and other things, but we always neglect kind of thinking towards the future, especially with our own children. I think out of fear, maybe, out of just not knowing what's going to happen, or out of just habit of just going through the motions. But it the the choices that you're making now have consequences in the future, and they don't seem like they're very small, but those behaviors that we're instilling in our children, because that's why Thomas, one of the things that scares him, not just the immediate, like the boys being boys. It's that these boys are gonna become men and they're going to still act like boys doing these stupid things and probably doing a lot worse things, because it seems like once they start getting away with stuff, and or they're, just getting in this pattern of behavior, it's much easier to get to the next thing and do the next thing and manipulate, and that just that sin kind of just manifests and grows within them.
Mhm.
So that's why those boundaries, are very important, because it's good that we play, but there's also a time and a place for everything.
I think it's worth mentioning when we're and Stacy brought this up, but I wanted to highlight that again, as homeschool families, we look for ways that our kids to be around other kids. But I think for all the families where the kids are in either Christian schools, public schools, to look for those opportunities to get them around adults,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that both are needed,
Yeah.
and that neither one is. I mean, this goes back to excess and defect. That if they're not around adults or that's all they're around, neither of those are good.
Right.
And again, our purpose, that again Stacy so eloquently put it, is raising godly children.
Yep.
So this takes us into this scripture, one of my favorite, Malachi 2:15. It says, "Did he not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth." So this is spoken in context of the this time in Israel's history where guys were just divorcing their women and breaking the family, and the whole purpose of starting the family, like the what we talk about in the philosophy circles, like the final cause. What is the purpose for which it was made? The family exists for godly children,
Hmm.
making these godly children. That's why God, in many ways, instituted the family. It serves many purposes that individually, God said, it's not good that man be alone. But again, in terms of the family, what does that family exist for? These godly children. And the concept of the godly children is that if we allow them to revel in their sin, in their depravity, in their immaturity, or whatever the culture says that they should be. I think that's the other thing that happens. A lot of parents feel pressured
Yeah.
to let their kids do what everyone else is doing and be the way everyone else is being. And I think it's a word that we can say to the parents, that you don't have to give into that,
Mm.
that your family can draw lines and say, that is not who we are. This is not how it works, and that's okay. And for the children to see that not as an act of looking down at everyone else, but understanding, taking that stand. In many ways, you're training them that when they have their values, to stand on those, and hopefully those values are Christ-like, godly values. And that's part of us showing them and walking them through that. So, what do you think is one of the bigger obstacles to as we're looking to raise godly children? So we'll talk from experience, real concrete. What has been, so we'll phrase it this way: what has been your greatest obstacle in raising those godly children? What have you found to be the kind of thing that you've either struggled with the most, or you found to be that was your greatest temptation to do? What's something that you've struggled with that you could share and say, hey, here's how I overcame this?
Oh, for me, like, because we're talking about just I mean, we kind of alluded to it when we're talking about, say, going, say, the public school, where it's the whole the worldview that permeates there isn't a godly, worldview, and you're there, and like, in you want your kids to socialize, but there's such, they're so influenced by the world. It's overwhelming them, because I have, as a pastor, I have teenagers that that some of them are going to public schools, and they're going through some terrible things that just because it was present to them, and just the amount of baggage that's all. I mean, one of my teenagers, like there's things that are coming up that could ruin his life, like just and it's just mind-boggling, and so the struggle for me is like where I have my children, and how much do I let them engage in worldly things? Like, because there is this, because we want to have some sort of like common ground with some folks and have conversations, and like there's things my boys went in because some of their friends are into it. It's good because they need to communicate. They need to have that. I remember how important that was for me, but like, where's the limits? What is appropriate? And like we talked about a little bit last time, like, well, like just gauging that, and how much you don't want to also coddle them to the point where they're like, they don't ever, then they get broadsided when they leave the home with all like the world, and they don't know what to do with it. So you kind of want to give them some exposure, but just have that like trying to figure out like that kind of like balance, and because to the point where that they're mature enough to actually understand it, like on not just take it in and just believe it, but they can analyze it a little bit and just not just, it's like that. I think that's the level of maturity that they need to have, so they're not just going to accept anything the world gives them. But I think there's that balance of trying to figure out when and where and how much is appropriate for them to engage in things outside the house, I guess.
That struggle is a very real struggle
Hmm.
for a lot of parents. And I think sometimes parents feel like, oh, I'm the only one who really struggles with this. Everyone seems to have it figured out. And I think what you're seeing is the results of these parents who've wrestled with it, who have made their decision, who are then moving forward. And so I encourage parents, just like you're saying, don't accept the formulas. Don't just be like, oh, let me just indiscriminately, well, this is what everybody's doing. Wrestle with those issues.
Yeah.
And there's an element of conscience that's in that. But if you don't feel at peace with some of these things, then, there might be a reason, there might be something.
Hmm.
Figure out, what that is. And so just encouraging parents to uh, don't feel the pressure and give in to the pressure. The whole idea of make virtuous decisions
Yeah.
and make the good decision. So what are some of the things that you have struggled with in this?
I think definitely what Thomas brought up is an issue for every family. I think, especially families that have that goal of raising godly men and women. But something I was thinking about is being consistent with what I would call habit training, and being consistent in r not letting vices take root in your children. Like, it's very easy to fall into that, survival mode of parenting that we were talking about, just, getting through the day and, no vision of the future. But if you just continue to let vices go unaddressed and unaddressed and unaddressed, then that becomes a habit. And then to try and retrain your child to not have that habit any longer is much more difficult than taking the energy and the effort to train them
Yeah.
in the vice to begin with. And but that is a really hard thing to do. I mean, we
It's
have
Yep.
so many things on our plates as parents if
Exactly.
we're working outside the home or we're working inside the home, or we're managing the children's activities, or whether we're schooling or public schooling or homeschooling. Both of those have their own set of
Yep.
responsibilities
Exactly.
and, their own lifestyle that you have to maintain, and so, parenting is, a 24/7
Yeah.
job, and it's really hard to maintain that level of commitment and consistency, um, on a day-to-day basis if you don't have that vision of, "Okay, my goal is to raise godly men and women, and I cannot let this vice, take root in my child." For one of our children, it's an issue of fortitude. Anything that's hard for him, he just quits. Doesn't wanna do it at all. It's too hard, not even gonna attempt it. He's done. But, we did have a small victory with that today. He was working on a piano lesson, came to that point, too hard, don't wanna do it. And, we just encouraged him to go back and do it, and he did. He stuck
That's
with
good.
it and overcame it, and that was a big victory for that child because that would not have happened in the past. But I think that falls back on me and Thomas
Yep.
for not rooting out that, what would you call the lack of fortitude, the
Device. It's a defect.
Yeah.
but, that
He has no endurance.
Thank you. I was like, what's the word? That lack of endurance
Exactly.
in him. If we just let that go on and on and on until adulthood, then every time he faces a difficult
Yeah, it's just
situation, he's just going to quit. And so I think those are the things that I don't want to say we're afraid to do as parents, but again, we just
mm-hmm.
have to be super consistent and make that concerted effort to not let those vices become habits. Now, I mean, obviously, correcting it one time, is probably not going to be enough, but correcting it, again and again, and, teaching the child, you need to have fortitude in this situation and in all situations. And it's going to carry
Yep.
over into your adulthood and help you to be a virtuous
Exactly.
man or woman.
Absolutely.
So I think with mine, real quick, as we're winding down, mine's a bit more concrete, simple, and it's fun, unfun having my wife in the room who understands these issues so implicitly that I think for me, with the challenge in raising godly children, and this is something that Stacy has pointed out to me, is like, just because it's funny, you don't have to do it, and you don't have to say it. Again, the head nods. And because it's true, that's my vice, that's my issue. And in raising godly children, I am reminded of my failures, because I think a lot of I'm at the tail end of Generation X. So I think for Gen X and older millennial parents, the kind of TV, the kind of things we saw growing up, that became part of our thinking. That became part of our mode of operation. And rooting that out, weeding that out, it's taken decades and it's still not out. And in raising godly children, trying to be that, and it's an ever present challenge for me to make that, to walk that line between, okay, this is funny and appropriate, and this is funny and maybe just not appropriate time, or pushed an envelope too far. These are the kinds of things that I think a lot of parents, hopefully out there, as we've kind of shared these, parents have sort of resonated. Yeah, yes, that's my issue. That's what I've got. But we're out of time for today. Thank you very much for the conversation. You can find our podcast, Virtuous Roots, on all major streaming platforms. Until next time, God bless.